We continue the Varieties of Religious Experience, a study in human nature by William James. We are in Lecture 2, Circumscription of the topic. So as you see, I was okay. The phone just dropped. He is a high-hearted freeman and no pining slave, and yet he lacks something which the Christian par excellence, the mystic and ascetic saint, for example, has in abundant measure, and which makes of him a human being of an altogether different denomination. The Christian also spurns the pinched and mumping sick-room attitude, and the lives of saints are full of a kind of callousness to the diseased conditions of body, which probably no other human records show. But whereas the merely moralistic spurning takes an effort of volition, the Christian spurning is the result of the excitement of a higher kind of emotion, in the presence of which no exertion of volition is required. The moralist must hold his breath and keep his muscles tense, and so long as this athletic attitude is possible, all goes well. Morality suffices, but the athlete's attitude tends ever to break down, and it inevitably does break down, even the most stalwart, when the organism begins to decay, or when morbid fears invade the mind. To suggest personal will and effort to one all sicklied, or with a sense of irremediable impotence, is to suggest the most impossible of things. What he craves is to be consoled in his very powerlessness, to feel that the spirit of the universe recognizes and secures him, all decaying and failing as he is. Well, we are all such helpless failures in the last resort. The sanest and best of us are of one clay with lunatics and prison inmates, and death finally runs the robustest of us down. And whenever we feel this, such a sense of the vanity and provinciality of our voluntary career comes over us, that all our morality appears but as a plaster hiding a sore it can never cure, and all our well-doing as the hollowest substance for that well-being that our lives ought to be grounded in, but alas, are not. And here religion comes to our rescue and takes our fate into her hands. There is a state of mind known to religious men, but to no others, in which the will to assert ourselves and hold our own has been displaced by a willingness to close our mouths and be as nothing in the floods and waterspouts of God. In this state of mind, what we most dreaded has become the habituation of our safety, and the hour of our moral death has turned into our spiritual birthday. The time for tension in our soul is over, and that of happy relaxation, of calm deep breathing, of an eternal present with no discordant future to be anxious about, has arrived. Fear is not held in abeyance as it is by mere morality. It is positively expunged and washed away. We shall see abundant examples of this happy state of mind in latter lectures of this course. We shall see how infinitely passionate a thing religion at its highest flights can be, like love, like wrath, like hope, ambition, jealousy, like every other instinctive eagerness and impulse. It adds to life an enchantment which is not rationally or logically deductible from anything else. This enchantment coming as a gift, when it does come, a gift of our organism, the physiologist will tell us, a gift of God's grace. The theologians say, is either there or not there for us, and there are persons who can no more become possessed by it than they can fall in love with a given woman by mere word of command. Religious feeling is thus an absolute addition to the subject's range of life. It gives him a new sphere of power. When the outward battle is lost and the outer world disowns him, it redeems and vivifies an interior world which otherwise would be an empty waste. If religion is to mean anything definite for us, it seems to me that we ought to take it as meaning this added dimension of emotion, this enthusiastic temper of espousal, in religions where morality, strictly so called, can, at best, but bow its head and acquiesce. It ought to mean nothing short of this new reach of freedom for us, with the struggle over, the keynote of the universe, sounding in our ears, an everlasting possession spread before our eyes. Once more, there are plenty of men, constitutionally somber men, in whose religious life this rapturousness is lacking. They are religious in the wider sense, yet in this acutest of all senses they are not so. And it is religion in the acutest sense that I wish, without disputing about words, to study first, so as to get at its typical differentia. This sort of happiness, in the absolute and everlasting, is what we find nowhere but in religion. It is parted off from all mere animal happiness, all mere enjoyment of the present, but that element of solemnity of which I have already made so much account. Solemnity is a hard thing to define abstractly, but certain of its marks are patent enough. A solemn state of mind is never crude or simple. It seems to contain a simple certain measure of its own opposite in solution. A solemn joy preserves a sort of bitter in its sweetness. A solemn sorrow is one to which we intimately consent. But there are writers who, realizing that happiness of a supreme sort is the prerogative of religion, forget this complication and call all happiness as such religious. Mr. Havelock Ellis, for example, identifies religion with the entire field of the soul's liberation from oppressive moods. In The New Spirit, page 232, the simplest functions of physiological life, he writes, may be its ministers. Everyone who is at all acquainted with the Persian mystics knows how wine may be regarded as an instrument of religion. Indeed, in all countries and in all ages, some form of physical enlargement, singing, dancing, drinking, sexual excitement, has been intimately associated with worship. Even the momentary expansion of the soul and laughter is, to however slight an extent, a religious exercise. Whenever an impulse from the world strikes against the organism, and the resultant is not discomfort or pain, not even the muscular contraction of strenuous manhood, but a joyous expansion or aspiration of the whole soul, there is religion. It is the infinite for which we hunger, and we ride gladly on every little wave that promises to bear us towards it. But, and then we continue on outside the quote, but such a straight identification of religion with any and every form of happiness leaves the essential peculiarity of religious happiness out. The more commonplace happiness which we get are reliefs, occasioned by our momentary escapes from evils, either experienced or threatened. But in its most characteristic embodiments, religious happiness is no more feeling of escape. It cares no longer to escape. It consents to the evil outwardly as a form of sacrifice. Inwardly, it knows it to be permanently overcome. If you ask how religion thus falls on the thorns and faces death, and in the very act annuls annihilation, I cannot explain the matter, for it is religion's secret, and to understand it you must yourself have been a religious man of the extremer type. In our future examples, even the simplest and healthiest minded type of religious consciousness, we shall find this complex, sacrificial constitution in which a higher happiness holds a lower unhappiness in check. In the Louvre, there is a picture by Guido Reni of St. Michael with his foot on Satan's neck. I'm not familiar with the picture, but I wonder how closely it connects to the Shiva ones. The richness of the picture is, in large part, due to the fiend's figure being there. The richness of its allegorical meaning also is due to his being there. That is, the world is all the richer for having a devil in it, so long as we keep our foot upon his neck. The Apep myth in Egypt has a similar note to it, doesn't it? In the religious consciousness, that is just the position in which the fiend, the negative or tragic principle, is found. And for that very reason, the religious consciousness is so rich from the emotional point of view. And he owes this allegorical illustration to his lamented colleague and friend, Charles Carroll Everett. We shall see how in certain men and women it takes on a monstrously ascetic form. There are saints who have literally fed on the negative principle, on humiliation and privation, and the thoughts of suffering and death, their souls growing in happiness just as, in proportion to their outward state, grew more intolerable. Well, if they were saintly, as in on God's side, they would work towards being pleased with both, right? No other emotion than religious emotion can bring a man to this peculiar pass, and it is for that reason that when we ask our question about the value of religion for human life, I think we ought to look for the answer among these volunteer examples rather than among those of a more moderate hue. Having the phenomenon of our study in its acutest possible form to start with, we can shade down as much as we please later, and if in these cases, repulsive as they are to our ordinary worldly way of judging, we find ourselves compelled to acknowledge religion's value and treat it with respect, it will have proved in some way its value for life at large, but subtracting and toning down extravagances, we may thereupon proceed to trace the boundaries of its legitimate sway. To be sure, it makes our task difficult to have to deal so much with eccentricities and extremes. How can religion, on the whole, be the most important of all human functions, you may ask? If every several manifestations of it, in turn, had to be corrected and sobered down and pruned away, such a thesis seems a paradox impossible to sustain reasonably. Well, there's a difference between religion itself and what's claimed for religion, right? Yet I believe that something like it will have to be our final contention, that personal attitude which the individual finds himself impelled to take up towards what he apprehends to be the divine, and he will remember that this was our definition, will prove to be both a helpless and sacrificial attitude. That is, we shall have to confess to at least some amount of dependence on sheer mercy, and to practice some amount of renunciation, great or small, to save our souls alive. The constitution of the world we live in requires it. And Behren sollst du, sollst en Behren, das ist der Weg Gesang der jedem an die Ohren klinget, denn unser ganzes Leben lang uns heißer jede Stund singt. I'm not totally sure about my pronunciation of German, right? For when all is said and done, we are in the end absolutely dependent on the universe, and into sacrifices and surrenders of some sort, deliberately looked at and accepted, we are drawn and pressed as into our only permanent positions of repose. Now in those states of mind which fall short of religion, the surrender is submitted to as an imposition of necessity, and the sacrifice is undergone at the very best without complaint. In the religious life, on the contrary, surrender and sacrifice are positively espoused, even unnecessary givings up are added in order that the happiness may increase. Religion thus makes easy and felicitous what in any case is necessary, and if it be the only agency that can accomplish this result, its vital importance as a human faculty stands vindicated beyond dispute. It becomes an essential organ of our life, performing a function which no other portion of our nature can so successfully fulfill. From the merely biological point of view, so to call it, this is a conclusion to which, so far as I can now see, we shall inevitably be led, and led, moreover, by the following, the purely empirical method of demonstration which I sketched to you in the first lecture. Of the farther office of religion as a metaphysical revelation, I will say nothing now, but to foreshadow the terminus of one's investigations is one thing, and to arrive at safety is another. In the next lecture, abandoning the extreme generalities which have engrossed us hitherto, I propose that we begin our actual journey by addressing ourselves directly to the concrete facts.